Good evening, I'm Jack Cole. On this, the third night of our week-long series, we focus on the new president's relations with Congress. The branch of government named first in the Constitution, but not, if the polls are to be believed, ranked first in the hearts of its countrymen. Even so, Ronald Reagan can do little without congressional support. The relationship is a fragile one, and it's quite symbiotic. Its success or its failure ultimately define a president's accomplishments. Here in Boston to explore this strange partnership are Professor Samuel Beer of Harvard and Jim King, a soldier in both Jack Kennedy's and Jimmy Carter's battles with Congress. And with us from Washington is Margaret Osmer. Margaret?
Thank you, Jack. There is persistent speculation here in Washington about a new era of cooperation between the new president and the Congress. But you wouldn't know it from the verbal battle being waged every day in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The confirmation of Alexander Haig as Secretary of State has never been in serious question, but the Democrats have been determined to let the general and the nation know their displeasure with his past before they let him take over his job as the president's chief foreign policy advisor. A not-so-gentle reminder from the Democrats to President-elect Reagan that no matter how cooperative they may be on issues, party opposition is still alive and well. For a closer look at how some individual members of Congress see their future relationship with the White House, here is reporter Gary Griffith.
If it's chillier than usual here on Capitol Hill, there's at least a feeling of optimism in the air and a somewhat universal belief that relations between the Congress and the President have nowhere to go but up. Jimmy Carter never made much of an attempt to court the Congress and was not exactly universally loved. On the subject of congressional relations, listen, for example, to California Democrat George Danielson, the Deputy Majority Whip, who voted with Carter 86% of the time.
One of President Carter's biggest problems was absolutely ineffective staff relations with the Congress. Just unbelievable.
Reagan has been quick to meet with the leaders of both parties, and with a Republican majority of 53 in the Senate, the Republicans can control the agenda there. Even liberal Democrats are not talking about a fight.
The American people did elect Ronald Reagan president. They did elect a Republican majority in the Senate, and for the welfare of the country, we all have to hope that he will be a successful president and that there will be an effective legislative program. So the Democrats are not going to be obstructive. We will support the president when we can. We will give him the benefit of the doubt. We will oppose him only when we feel we must on a matter of fundamental principle.
In the House, Speaker O'Neill will not only rule, but will be the second most powerful man in the government. He, too, has pledged cooperation, although the Democratic majority does intend to block Reagan on several social issues, particularly on cuts in Social Security or in the minimum wage. But Reagan will have help from conservative Democrats and from a much younger, more aggressive, and more conservative Republican minority, one that caused Minority Leader John Rhodes to step down.
I felt that perhaps the dominant trend of those who were being elected to the Congress led them in some directions with some emphasis that I probably would not have followed.
Elected as new Minority Leader, Bob Michel of Illinois is a moderate, not exactly a new right type, but he's promised his colleagues to take the offensive.
We've got to be affirmative in our position and forward-looking. And the bottom line is enactment of the Reagan program. Let's not ever forget it. And with the Democrats losing the White House and the other body, no question but that tension will be focused on our body. The fight will be fought here in the House of Representatives.
And elected to the third-ranking leadership post of Republican Conference Chairman is conservative comer Jack Kemp. This whole new group of aggressive young Republicans is on Reagan's side, to be sure, but they may be more anxious to push the Democrats than the administration is.
We have to cooperate enough with the Democrats in the House to try to pass Reagan's program, but at the same time, we have to recognize that the liberals who have traditionally been in favor of policies I oppose and have opposed policies I favor still run the House.
So the outlook for the Reagan administration may not be entirely rosy. The Republicans will continue to get opposition in the Democratic House, as they did in their first session last week, when Democrats would not agree to change their 2-to-1 majorities on the Ways and Means and Rules committees. But members of both parties, aware of the message in the election return, seem ready for a change from Carter economics, and there is an overall mood of change and new purpose here. Like Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan will arrive here with no real Washington experience, but he's not expected to remain an outsider long, nor to try to. From Washington, this is Gary Griffith reporting.
We will continue this discussion of President-elect Reagan's relation with Congress with Utah Senator Jake Garn, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, and on the House side with Ohio Congressman Clarence Brown, member of the Joint Economic Committee, and with reporter Charles McDowell of the Richmond Times-Dispatch. But first, let's return to Boston for some background. Jack?
Thanks, Margaret. We have become accustomed to thinking of the White House as the fulcrum of power in Washington. As Jimmy Carter, for one, can testify, it ain't necessarily so. Ronald Reagan's predecessor had what might be termed a theoretical political control over the legislative branch. His Democratic Party had just about two-thirds of the seats in both houses. But with a few exceptions, Congress was just not disposed to enact what the president proposed. The new president has a 6-seat margin in the Senate, but it is the House which must initiate all tax legislation. Thus, the Democrats have the power to grant or deny the new president's wish for tax cuts to stimulate the economy. And as Gary Griffith noted in his report, Democrats are not ordinarily inclined to dismantle federal agencies, the brand new Departments of Energy and Education for two, let alone to reduce spending for food stamps, school lunches, seat-a-job training. We have, in other words, the makings of a stalemate. Ronald Reagan may very well have to call on all the skills he developed in Hollywood and in Sacramento if he's to move Congress his way. The Hollywood side of Ronald Reagan's experience will be invaluable if the new president chooses to try to mobilize public opinion to move Congress in his direction. Michael Wheeler has our report tonight on what the polls say Mr. Reagan's leverage might be.
Public opinion either lubricates or irritates a president's relationship with Congress. When a president's popularity is high, he can go over the heads of a stubborn Congress to rally support for key programs. A president whose ratings are low can be a political orphan. The polls for all modern presidents have followed virtually the same course. Support declines through the first 3 years, then usually rebounds in the final year of the term. This has been just as true for Republicans as it has for Democrats. Reagan is thus likely to have his greatest popular leverage over Congress in 1981. Even as a president's popularity wanes, he may still use Congress as a whipping boy for the government's ills. As that body which deals with the specifics of spending, regulation, and taxes, Congress is vulnerable to criticism. According to a 1980 poll, while 39% of the public thought the president deserved a lot of blame for inflation, 69% pointed at Congress. Much has been said about the declining respect for the presidency, but over the last decade, the image of Congress has deteriorated even more dramatically. In 1967, 41% of those polled said that they had a great deal of confidence in Congress. By 1973, the confidence rating had dwindled to 29. Last year, it was in the teens. Reagan, like Carter, campaigned as an outsider to the Washington political establishment, and a key to his coming battles, particularly with the democratically controlled House, will lie in how effectively he exploits his personal popularity and national cynicism about Congress to create a groundswell to enact his legislative agenda. This is Michael Wheeler reporting.
The last couple of nights at about this point, we've taken a look at the individuals on the Reagan team with direct authority over the substantive area that we were talking about. With Congress, the people in charge are not on the Reagan team in any formal or real sense. Even Howard Baker, the Republican leader of the Senate, is answerable first to the voters of Tennessee, then to his colleagues on the Hill, and only then to the new president. All presidents have allies in Congress, of course. Mr. Reagan has a staunch political and personal friend in Senator Paul Laxalt of Nevada. They have been intimate since Reagan first cut his teeth as a Republican in the 1964 Goldwater campaign. Congressman Tom Evans of Delaware is the new president's man about the House, and Max Friedersdorf, President Ford's congressional lobbyist, will carry Reagan's message up Capitol Hill on a regular basis. The perspective from the Hill and the view from down Pennsylvania Avenue are frequently very different. Well, Margaret Osmer can see both from where she sits in Washington. Margaret?
That's true, Jack, but yesterday I sat in the office of Utah Senator Jake Garn, and I asked him what specific problems President-elect Reagan might have with this Congress.
His first problem is going to be to get the Congress to enact whatever his economic cuts are in the budget, which I hope will be as deep as he has promised, and also to enact his tax package. Those are both going to be very big efforts and a test of his ability to get legislation through Congress early. and it's going to take some political courage. And I believe that we must stand firm and recognize that the collective economy over the next few years is more important than the individual economy at this point, and take some political heat and have some anger from constituencies around this country, because if we don't, it will be business as usual. The budget will never be balanced. They will say, well, the Republicans had their chance, they failed, let's put the Democrats back in.
What is the likelihood that's going to happen?
I think the Democrats have recognized as well this mood of the people, and I think this Congress and this president are going to be more successful than we have had in a long, long time. Maybe not as much as Jake Garn would like to see cut, but I think that the American people are going to be surprised that President Reagan will send up some tough budgeting, and that I think the Congress will pass more of it than a lot of people think we will.
Let's look at the new configuration of Congress. There's no longer the party system the way it used to be. There's no longer party discipline in the same way. President-elect Reagan aside, what problems would this cause for any president with this Congress?
There is no doubt that there is not the party discipline that there used to be, where parties met and had a caucus and said, we will vote, and everybody has to vote the way the majority voted. That has not existed since I have been in the Senate. That's why I believe the personal relationships and the communication that President-elect Reagan is already building up will be very helpful because of that. He will not be able to rely totally on the Republicans just to vote in bloc because he wants us to. But on the other hand, I think he's going to have a good deal of support from the Democratic side. And those kind of personal relationships, the communication, him coming to the Hill to consult with us rather than demanding or threatening or trying to dictate what our policy should be. That's been my experience with him when he was governor of California, that he was very, very successful working with a democratically controlled legislature. Now at least he has a Republican Senate, and although the party discipline is not there, I think we're going to see the best relationship between Congress and a president that we've seen in this town in a long time.
As Senator Garn has pointed out, his party's in the majority in the Senate, but where you sit, Congressman Brown, the Republicans are still in the minority. Do you therefore share his optimism?
I think Jake's analyzed it pretty well. There's a difference in the House, but some of the environment is the same. Those fellows on the left side of the House, many of them, along with the left side of the Senate, were invited out for the election, and as they walked out of the door, they got shot. So those that are left, many of them have moved their seats over to the right side. There is a conservative movement within the Democratic side, the majority side of the House, as well as the minority side, the Democratic side of the Senate. I don't think we can forget, however, that Congress still disposes, even though the President proposes, and the President's going to have to work with individual Democratic leaders and some Republican leaders who tend to be specialists in certain areas.
Let's talk a little bit about the conservative Democrats. Can they tip the balance, and how do you think the President-elect is going to work to get them to tip the balance in his favor?
Well, I think going in they already have. For instance, Congressman Jim Jones from Oklahoma, who was perhaps the most conservative of three possible choices by the Democratic caucus to be the new chairman of the Budget Committee, and certainly a guy who has been able to work with Republicans in the Congress to put together tax legislation in his position in the Ways and Means Committee, has been named chairman of the Budget Committee. And he's likely to be cooperative with the new president, I think, and be willing to work with Republicans in some committees. I think the Republicans will have policy control of those committees because there will be congressmen on the Democratic side who will support Republican positions. Now, the Democrats still have parliamentary control, so they can keep things from coming up for consideration, and in those areas, the president's going to have to work through the Senate where he has a majority, get his issues passed, and then they'll come to the House, and it will be much more difficult for the Democrats to stop them. But you're going to have a committee like the Rules Committee in the hands of the liberals now, as it used to be in the hands of conservatives, doing the same thing as it did when it was in the hands of conservatives. They were trying to stop liberal legislation. The liberals will be trying to stop conservative legislation.
What about the Republicans, though? Will they be able to hold ranks? We've heard Congressman Rhodes talk about a generation gap within the Republican Party.
Well, the Republicans have been the most cohesive body in the Congress when we were in the minority down at 149 or 159 members. Now that we're a little bit larger, there may be some break-off, but I think Republicans have been so long waiting for this power to come that there's likely to be a lot of support for their president. And as noted, this is a very persuasive president. He's pretty good on the stump. He's the guy who literally has moved the country in this direction in those radio shows and television talks that he used to give. And if you disagreed with it, he'd be a tough one to take on.
Thank you, Congressman. I'd like to turn now to Charles McDowell and get the reporter's point of view. How would you assess the strategy so far that President-elect Reagan has used in laying the groundwork for his relations with Congress?
Well, it seems to me in terms of style, Margaret, he's done a really good job. He's catered to the congressional leadership. He's been to see every Democrat on Capitol Hill. He's done all the things that Carter didn't do. So he's prepared sort of the style approach has been good. Now comes the harder part, the tactics. There's still debate about it among the Republicans, but it appears that what they're going to do is the easy things first. And I submit that a tax cut, enacting a tax cut for everybody and credits for business to encourage investment, get the economic engine running, is not really hard. Those things will probably come first. Then it gets hard when you begin taking things away from people.
Then what happens?
Then it gets tough, and then we see how much he has rallied the country. Then we see how much party discipline the Republicans have. Then we see how tough the Democrats really are.
But what happens if he stumbles? What will he use?
Well, when he runs into trouble, it seems to me, Congressman Brown has said it, and Senator Garn said it. It seems to me this president's greatest strength is his ability to go on the television and speak to the people. We talk so much about presidents going over the heads of Congress. We have one that can do it. And if the people support him, the pressure from the people back on the Congress is his method for getting what he wants.
But this sounds a little bit like a loving. Now, what if, contrary to all of this optimism, he has an early defeat?
If he has an early defeat, it can damage him. I just can't speculate, Margaret. A more likely possibility is that what we get is a tax cut, increasing inflation, and he begins to be discredited in the country. And the pressure to balance the budget, cut increases, and it's harder to get those cuts. He can get into a labyrinth of trouble that way. But I can't say when or how.
Well, let me ask you, Congressman Brown, there's an issue that you talked about, members of Congress being shot as they walked out the door, and that brings up the issue of constituency pressure. And I wonder what you think the constituency pressure on the congressmen might be that might pull them away from voting with President-elect Reagan.
Clearly, special interest groups, when it comes to cutting the budget, are going to be putting pressure on members of Congress. And it depends on whether or not the president has been able to sell that, whether or not those interest groups are also kind of submissive because they think the president has been pretty persuasive in making the argument against their interests. I have the feeling that we'll all be, again, a little reluctant to take on the president. On the other hand, members of Congress have tended to be independent, not only of party but of presidents, to adhere to the interests of their constituencies. That's why so many of them have gotten reelected over the years.
Do you agree with that, Charles?
I think I generally agree with it.
Michael Wheeler talked earlier about how the image of Congress has been tarnished over the years in the public mind. I wonder, Mr. McDowell, if you agree with that and what effect you think that's going to have on how Congress will react to President-elect Reagan's demands.
The image of Congress has been tarnished by things like Abscam, and polls keep showing that everybody thinks most congressmen are no good at all, but theirs is all right. I would submit that Congress is probably in a stronger position right now with the people than the presidency is.
Yeah.
I think Mr. Reagan's problem, looking at it from the White House with the Congress, is not whether it's tarnished or not, but how much attention it's paying to provincial matters, its own little districts, rather than larger national matters. Tip O'Neill, for one, says Congress has become a very provincial place.
Well, now we'll go to Boston for a little different point of view from our guest commentators there. Jack?
Thank you, Margaret. Here in Boston, we have two men who've dealt with several Congresses. First, Professor Samuel Beer of Harvard, who went to Washington with Franklin Roosevelt, the president who pushed through in 100 days the most sweeping package of new laws the nation had or has ever seen. And Jim King, who worked for Jimmy Carter and Jack Kennedy, two presidents who were a bit less successful on Capitol Hill. First, Professor Beer, there's been a good deal written about Ronald Reagan and Franklin Roosevelt having much in common. Do you think that's valid?
Yes, I think in one sense that and Reagan makes an unusual Republican president. He's an activist. He wants to do something.
He wants to get in there and make government accomplish something. I don't say he's trying to dismantle the New Deal that Roosevelt built up. This makes him quite different from the usual string of Republicans who are in there to sort of hold things together. But I think the parallel, if I may inject a nonpartisan and objective note, which you would expect from me, is really with Eisenhower in a certain sense. That is to say, Eisenhower was elected in '52, got both houses, and he proceeded with a Republican cabinet very much like this one, big business, and he repealed, he lowered taxes, he cut taxes for business, and he resisted spending, and in the end we had the Eisenhower Depression, which was the thing that brought Jack Kennedy to power. Gave him the occasion to get the country moving again. And in my nonpartisan way, perhaps I would see Reagan doing the same thing, bringing a second Kennedy, whose name you might be able to guess, to power in a few years from now.
Perhaps that ought to lead us to Jim King, who has worked for another fellow named Kennedy over time, but also for Jack Kennedy, the late president, and for Jimmy Carter, lately the president of the United States. How do you see things shaping up for Ronald Reagan? There'll be a honeymoon period, there always is. I remember that 4 years ago at about this time, and even a few days after this time, everybody was saying that as a matter of style, Carter had really done wonderfully well. He had walked down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House, if you'll recall. He was getting on well with Congress before anybody had really taken position or sent anything up the hill. But then when he did, water projects and other kinds of things just soured his relationship with Congress before he got started.
There was, as you suggest, it was a question of style. I think the contrast between Reagan and Carter comes to that initially. First, is the Congress disposed to either person? I think President Carter had some serious problems with the Congress because first he ran against the Congress as an institution and Washington as an institution also. You mentioned the water. I think that's a good one. Early on in the administration, the president didn't consult with the people that was going to affect. He merely announced it. Now, I'm not into whether the water projects were good or not so good. I'll leave that to others. But the thing was that you consult with Congress. You talk to the leaders. You let people know what's happening. In Washington, the best surprise is no surprise. And I think Ronald Reagan has indicated that he is going to bend over backward to work with the Congress. I think there's another extraordinary thing that's happened, too, in the Congress itself, Jack. This is the first time, I believe, since Herbert Hoover's 71st Congress, is it? And that was 1931-33, where you had the split of the houses on parties. Traditionally, it's either been Republican both houses or Democratic both houses. So really, in no living...
Eisenhower's second term was, the second 2 years of his first term, he had a Republican Senate and a Democratic-controlled House.
The Evan Charlie show right on, in that early part, and then it changed on over. To have both houses split in this way is going to be a very delicate move.
But I think it makes that much difference anymore, Jim. That is, the parties have become, as this young woman pointed out, so fluid and so flaccid. They really don't mean much anymore. For instance, I read the other day that there's a group of Southern Democrats especially who formed the, what's it called, the Conservative Democratic Forum, about 40 of them in the House. Now, what kind of a Democratic Party have you got when you have a group like that who are set up as a party within a party?
But they've always been that way. You talked about...
But they weren't that organized.
Well, when you talked about President Kennedy, and by the way, I should give a modest disclaimer, I was carrying a spear somewhere in the background on that. I don't want to suggest I was out front any stretch of... Dave Powers would never forgive me. But I think what the difference was in this, Sam, was that the Congress and the party system had existed. Now, to suggest when President Kennedy went there, for example, the Southern chairman controlled the Congress. They controlled the Senate. I mean, take a look at the lineup in there. They absolutely, that was a system. They didn't need that formal organization. They met informally over drinks in Senator so-and-so's office. And the congressional liaison would appear, sit down, pick up a glass of whatever, and join in the fellowship of the event and be able to have accurate intelligence to bring back to the White House. This wasn't the case in President Carter's operation. It was very different. For example, he had two people in the Hill on the Senate side, overwhelmed, no matter how gifted they might be.
Sam, is Congress more or less responsible, in a general public sense, be responsive to the White House now than it was in Kennedy's time and in Roosevelt's time?
More, this varies. The Congress has these two sides, the one which people like to emphasize, namely the very localistic and parochial side where they respond to pressure groups and special interest groups and the elderly, people like me and so on. And then, quite frankly, the congressmen there want to cut a figure. They want to do something for the national interest. They love to be remembered, to think they'll be remembered in history. And they're very much influenced by this if you can convince them.
Yes,
Jim.
but the quote...
And they'll forget their dams and their bridges and the rest. If you can give them an idea that this is something necessary for the national, and if Reagan can do that, if he can, he'll be able to do a great many things I don't want to see happen.
There's going to be 535 liberals when you talk about Social Security. They're all going to be there. I don't know of anyone who's going to cut Social Security and the benefits to the American people. You're not going to have a giant step back. You're going to have a trimming of the edges. You're not going to see any new initiatives. No large initiatives will come out of this 2 years. You're going to see a trimming and a cutting and a molding, but you aren't going to see the great social program of any kind.
Thank you, gentlemen.
If
Speculation about Ronald Reagan as president goes beyond the nature of his method of dealing with Congress to the broader question of what will be the personality of the new administration in all areas. The tone, of course, is set by the president himself, but an early indication of what we might expect can be drawn from taking a look at some of the people Ronald Reagan has chosen to work for him. We will do just that tomorrow night at this same hour. I'll see you then, Jack.
Thank you, Margaret. See you then, too. And thanks here in Boston to Jim King and Sam Beer. Until then, tomorrow night at this hour, for Margaret Osmer and Public Television, I'm Jack Cole. Good night.
When Reagan Takes Power is a production of WGBH Boston and of the Institute of Politics, Harvard University. They are solely responsible for its content.
Captain ABC News is next here on Channel 2.
For this program was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.